Aaron Siri, all the way from Scottsdale, Arizona. Thanks for joining me, and thanks for the work you've been doing recently. You're a lawyer, the managing partner of Siri Glimstad, which is a big law firm in the US, dealing sort of almost with a market of civil liberties and a whole lot of other things, but with a particular interest in vaccine injury claims. And that seems to have occupied a lot of your time. You obviously been around doing this work for a while. You're the author of a book, Vaccines, Amen, the religion of vaccines, you've called it, which I'm halfway through. And of course, for a lot of people, you came to prominence back in September when you fronted the US Senate on a hearing which was called how the corruption of science has impacted public perception of policy regarding vaccines hearing. And you delivered a really important evidence testimony to that hearing, which I think is the thing that brought the Henry Ford study to light, which I want to talk about as well. But it's been a sort of a very interesting journey to get here, and thank you for doing it, because I always say that makes you based. So you get the stamp. There'll be a graphic that will go over the top of it there as well, no doubt. But it is very, very important. It's an important conversation that hasn't been had enough, I think, particularly in Australia. How did you get to this point, though, where the interest in this area of the law and of course regulation of vaccines piqued your interest?
Well, I think it all started when I learned a singular fact, and that was the existence of the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act of 1986. That's a federal law in the United States that makes it so that if your child dies, if your child is seriously injured from a vaccine, you cannot sue the company that sells that vaccine to claim if they had made it safer, your child wouldn't have died. Your child wouldn't have gotten seriously injured. There is no other product in this country that has that immunity. None, not planes, not cars, not sheetrock, not floorboards, nothing. Every product that you and I are in the surroundings that the viewers watching this podcast see, the sign behind you, if that thing emits something that causes you cancer, you can bring that lawsuit. If that furniture behind you emits stuff, if it's made out of chemicals that are improper, you name it. But you can't do the vaccines. And at the time I learned that, this was a long time ago. I was working at one of the biggest firms in the United States, representing, Fortune 50, massive corporations, and, bet the company multi-billion-dollar disputes. And, I didn't understand anything about vaccinology or immunology or infectious disease or pediatrics back then. But I do understand how corporations work and what motivates them and how conflicts of interest work. And when you think about how decisions are made by big companies, what goes on in boardrooms, they don't make decisions based on ethical or moral. I mean, they do as long as it is good for their bottom line. They make decisions based on what is in their economic interest. You get a CEO of a big corporation and they don't make decisions what's best for the bottom line, they're gone. That board is making decisions based on something, they're gone. That's how they make their decisions. And so when you created that immunity, that struck me immediately as, whoa, something is really wrong. This is the product they tell you is safe. This is the product they tell you is completely safe. 1 in a million harm. Injected into babies over and over again. But yet that's the product that needs this immunity? Very discordant. And that immunity inverts the normal economic interests that corporations have. Corporations normally have an economic interest to make products safe because they don't want to lose money. So they self-regulate. That's why most products are safe. They're not safe because of the government. No offense to any government officials. They're safe because of economic self-interest of companies. They want to make money. So drugs, for example, in the US where you can sue, they have multi-year placebo-controlled trials before they're licensed. Why? Because the company wants to know if they're safe before they go to market. But with vaccines, they don't have that incentive. They have the opposite incentive economically to get it on the market with as little safety testing as possible because they're not going to be liable for the harms for the most part when it goes in the market. So that's all way to say, how did I start with this? When I learned about that law in the context of the type of commercial litigation work I was doing at the time, and my journey continued on from there.
Yeah, I mean, that law is fascinating in the sense it is because, you're absolutely right. If you had a car that just burst into flames every now and then, the market would self-regulate. You wouldn't get insurance. You wouldn't, the company would lose a lot of money. So the whole concept of giving a manufacturer immunity like that is counterintuitive. Do you know, in terms of the background of that, how did that come about? Because obviously that has had a big impact on how the industry has unfolded from there.
Well, the reason it came about was that leading up to 1986 in the United States, there were only three routine vaccines: MMR, DTP, and OPV. That's it. Okay. A baby actually, following the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control schedule in the United States, back in 1986, would only get three injections by year one of life. That's it. But the amount of harm and injury those three products were causing made all the manufacturers go out of business or stop making that product. We went from about six manufacturers of pertussis vaccine down to one, about six for measles down to one, three for polio down to one. And when a industry faces that juncture, right, where they're going to lose more money than they can make on a product, what do? You make a better, safer product. Your plane falls out of the sky, make a safer plane. Your gas tank blows up, to use your example, make a better gas tank, make a better car. Your product has a chemical that's causing cancer, make a better product. Here, the United States Congress did something unprecedented effectively. Instead of letting the market force these companies to make a better, safer product, it said, you know what? We're just going to pass this law and we're going to make it. So all those families you're hurting, they just can't sue you. So you could keep selling your product. And not only did they give them that immunity under the National Childhood Vaccine Draft of 1986 for those three vaccines, they gave it for any other routine vaccine developed thereafter. A child today following the CDC schedule in the United States gets 29 injections by the first year of life. And almost every one of those vaccines was developed by a pharmaceutical company knowing they would not be liable for the injuries caused on the basis they could have made the product safer.
I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, and there's a lot of interesting stuff just with the ex-legal background that I've been interested as well. I heard you say I think on Tucker Carlson's podcast that you have to then, as a result of that, you have to issue proceedings against the Secretary of Health, which ironically at the moment is Robert Kennedy. So I assume you've got claims running around where, from a sort of functionary point of view, you've had to do that. Is it a big area?
We sue him every day.
Yeah. Yeah. Is it a big area of law? I mean, are there a lot of claims that are arising? I mean, I don't know of any in Australia. I don't see them all, obviously, but I don't know of any.
Yeah.
Are you seeing a sort of a sad growth in that area?
Well, I'll say 2 points on that. First one is, I often get people say to me, well, vaccines cause injuries. I would know it. And I always respond with, I'm always wondering, like, well, why do you think you would know it? Do you know what drugs just came off the market? Do you know what injuries those drugs caused? No. In the same way, but do you think those drug injuries weren't real? Do you think those drugs didn't cause those injuries? No, you don't contest that. You don't think that that's, oh, that's just conspiracy. You just don't know what happens, because until that drug hurts you or your kid or your family, why would you know? Right? It's the same thing with vaccines. Those impacted, they know. And by the way, they don't want to talk about it because they don't want to get the label that comes with it. So oftentimes, those who are injured by vaccines suffer in silence, if they even associate their injury with a vaccine. Most of the folks we represent who are injured by vaccines are actually often medical professionals, doctors, nurses. Why? They actually can recognize, oh, I all of a sudden have this dysautonomia after that flu shot. I got a Hep B shot and I've got this, various neurological issue. They associate, they'll recognize it, and they will actually often be the ones who call our firm, where the average person, they're not going to associate their, neurological or immunological issue with vaccination. With that said, to answer the last part of your question, yes, there is a program in the United States that if you are injured by a vaccine, you can bring a claim. You can't sue the pharmaceutical companies. Congress recognized, well, we got to give these people some avenue of relief. And so instead, they created something called the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. I believe you have something similar in Australia, okay, where if you are injured by a vaccine, you can bring a claim in that program. You sue the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, okay? You're suing the very federal health department in the U.S. that told you the product's safe, that's responsible for safety. You think that conflicts them, by the way, from doing safety studies? Of course it does. Because if they do a safety study that shows the vaccine causes harm, we'll use it against them in vaccine court. And when we bring that claim on behalf of petitioners, we have to fight against a little law firm called the Department of Justice. You might have heard of them. Okay. They have all our money. They take it from our via taxes, and then they use it to fight against petitioners. And unlike an actual typical court proceeding, you don't get discovery. We can't depose the companies that make these products. We can't get their documents. And so we have our hands tied behind our back when we bring these cases. On the other hand, the government gets at least 3 years of our clients' medical records to poke shots at it. And you don't get a judge appointed under the Constitution. You get something called a special master. So this program is very policy driven. It really restricts the rights of petitioners greatly. There are certain injuries they just, almost on a policy basis won't pay. For example, they don't want to pay for dead babies because they're worried about vaccine hesitancy. And the amount of paid is capped at $250,000 for death and for pain and suffering, which is where you would get most of your damages. This program has paid out about over $5 billion for injuries over the years, but I would say that's a very small tip of the iceberg. If you actually let the companies be held accountable, it would be far, far greater than that amount, and you'd actually have a self-correction when it comes to these products.
And you talk about that. That's really is the premise of the book. That this is sort of shows all the signs of being a religion rather than a scientific pursuit. You see that everywhere. I mean, that's such a big topic in itself. That's why the 300 pages of the book are dedicated to it. But it is like that. I mean, I remember through the COVID period, the people that were most visceral in their rejection of any problems were the doctors. It was almost as if the doctors were taking it very personally, like you were attacking them personally in some instances. Obviously, there are a lot of good ones as well, a lot. But it has developed this religious-like fervor. Why is that? Like, what has that been deliberately planted? Has that happened organically, or is it a combination of both?
Well, on the why part, I would say that, like every good business, you want to promote your product so you could sell as much of it as possible. And when you're making money from a product, you reinvest to continue and make sure you're perpetuating profits year after year. Car companies, they invest in commercials, right? And when you hear about a problem with the car, it's often in a newspaper after a lawsuit, isn't it? Right. And so how do pharmaceutical companies promote their product? Right. The way they do it is through trusted sources typically. They fund the medical journals. They fund the medical schools. They fund the doctor conferences. They have the pharma reps go into the office. I mean, they basically have their finger financially in every aspect of the medical community. That's not a conspiracy. That's just good business. Okay. So they don't invest in commercials. They put their billions of dollars every year. They make billions every year. So they'll put $1 billion aside as a kitty to make sure that they continue to promote their products, often through intermediaries, trusted intermediary sources. Now, when it comes to the religious aspect of it, then why do doctors go along with it, right? To your point, it's because, after 40 years of just nobody's standing in their way. Who's standing in their way? The lawyers? No. The class action lawyers and the product liability lawyers are neutered. I have over 50 people at my firm that just do vaccine related work. Do we sue pharma companies for class actions? We can't typically. I have over another 50 people at my law firm that just do plaintiff side class actions. We bring lawsuits for data breaches, violations of genetic privacy, biometric violation, you name it, a car paint peeling, the real ills of society, right? We bring all it, but we can't do that. So not the lawyers are not holding them accountable. They don't have a self-economic interest. And the government regulators that we just discussed are completely conflicted. So who's pushing back on this industry? Nobody. There's no conspiracy in that. It's just a completely broken system. There's no other product that operates in that kind of no pushback environment. So what do you have? You have this constant messaging to doctors about these products. They've saved everybody. They've saved millions. This is what they hear. They hear these mantras over and over. Do they ever look at the data themselves? No. Do the pediatricians look at it? No. Do anybody in the medical profession? Do even the immunologists or the infectious disease doctors look at that data? I could tell you from deposing many of them, they don't. They just believe that these mantras are true. Everyone would die without these products. Well, did they ever look at how many people actually died before there were the products in each year? I lay that out in my book based on the actual data. They don't. So when your knowledge is based on believing something. You're like, not based on actual knowledge. What do you draw from when you're challenged? You're the doctor. You're the credentialed professional. Somebody's challenged you on vaccines. You can't draw from here. You can't draw from your intellect because you never looked at it. So you draw from here. You draw from your emotions. That's why you often see anger. I see it in my depositions all the time. When I confront these doctors with the evidence, often I get hear reactions from, anger or so forth. The doctors will often go one of two ways. Either what I find is they will look at it and they will go, "Whoa," and they will have a moment where they go, "Okay, I have to rethink this," and that there are many doctors that do that. I know many of them; they're incredible doctors. Or they go the other way and they go, "I cannot accept this into my thinking because it's too much cognitive dissonance for me. It means I can't necessarily trust everything the CDC says or the FDA says. It's too much cognitive dissonance." So they resort to, "You're stupid. You're bad. You're crazy. You're anti-science. You're anti-vax. You're this. You're less than human." And you dehumanize. You make them the other. And that's often what you see, unfortunately, is too many doctors go this way instead of, "Yeah, I really should think about this way."
And it's become like that. I mean, certainly in Australia, general practitioners who would be the ones who'd be front and centre on this. It's probably different in the United States, where I think there are some incentives. That's not the case in Australia, as I understand it, or I'm sure someone will probably correct me. But certainly it is the case that it's a busy, busy practice, and so it is very difficult for people who, unless you're heavily invested in understanding really how this has played out, to get that information. You're downstream from all of that. So as you say, you're just collecting all of that, and people trust the regulators, they trust the journals, which I think is an interesting concept in this day and age, frankly. And moreover, I think there's a certain element of fear in the Australian medical profession. We are heavily regulated since 2009 by a regulatory body. Is that the case in the United States as well? Is there enough freedom for doctors to say, perhaps during COVID, "I don't recommend this for you"? Because in Australia, a lot of doctors found themselves falling foul of their own medical regulators for simply taking a different view to you must be injected for COVID-19 using the new experimental therapies. So is that the case in the United States? Or does it vary state to state?
In many states, they are you are the doctors are persecuted, to put it mildly, if they go against the dogma. Within the medical profession itself, um, you know, those who are harshest are often harshest on those who are closest to the church, so to speak. So maybe they'll accept some lawyer saying this stuff, but they're one of their own. Mm-mm. I mean, endless numbers of doctors get their license taken away. They get attacked by their medical boards, and these boards often sit. They're made by other doctors who also know nothing about these products, and unfortunately, oftentimes their rulings state it does vary by state. Okay, their rulings unfortunately are not really they're not subject to almost any real review by the courts. So you're basically, it's a kangaroo quote unquote court. Now it's not true of every state. Like in Florida, they are better. As an example, under Joe Ladapo, who was the Surgeon General, was their leadership. But it's pretty bad in many of the states.
Yeah, just on that subject, I heard you speak about this sort of dispelling how over the course of your time in the law, like a lot of times. I mean, I remember this from a long time ago when I did this. You become very, very familiar with an area of expertise. So I think lawyers that are across this are sometimes, dare I say it, more across it than many of the doctors are, because they've been surrounded by the evidence, surrounded by the data, surrounded by the people that talk this language. So, I think you have developed a very strong sense of the data, and the data doesn't reflect the dogma in many respects. You talked on Tucker Carlson's podcast about this sort of theory that the vaccination program had eliminated measles, but you say you can very clearly show that that is not the case, and I'm sure that's the case with many. But can you explain that? How is it the case that you can unpick that mantra?
Well, yes, I have to be pretty versant in, vaccinology, portions of immunology, pediatrics, infectious disease, to cross-examine the experts. So a large portion of my bookshelf is not law books; it's medical textbooks. I, as I said in the Senate hearing, I don't get to appeal to titles. I don't have a PhD. I don't have an MD. When I go into court and I have to litigate vaccines, I have to actually bring in, federal government data, high impact journal for whatever that's worth, and so forth, kind of sources. And I have to actually show. I mean, most of our vaccine injury cases, for example, even in this program, we have to literally prove causation. How did the vaccine cause it? Even if there's no other explanation. Baby comes in totally healthy. Obviously, most babies don't die from vaccines, thank God. But we have instances the baby comes in within 10 minutes as a grand mal seizure, is dead within 12 hours, rushed to the hospital. There's no other explanation for it. It's so clearly the vaccine. But I have to prove the biological mechanism from the injection. How did it cause the death? I still have to prove that. Okay. So yes, we have to be versant in the primary sources and the underlying data, which is why, for example, we have most of the clinical trial reports for the various vaccines because we want good clinical trial data. If I want to prove causation, I need good clinical trials. I want good clinical trials for these vaccines. I need them. I want good post-marketing licensure literature on vaccine safety. It's mostly vacuous. I know what the literature safety, vaccine safety literature on Hep B is, for example, and I know what the clinical trials are. We need that data. How else are we going to prove a vaccine caused injury? We need that stuff. And I can tell you it's pretty sad. Now, on the measles point, um, the measles vaccine, unlike most vaccines, actually can prevent the transmission of the measles virus for some duration of time in most people. Okay. So I think that maybe what you're referring to is that um, a lot of folks will say, well, it stops transmission of measles. End of story. Nothing else to talk about. And what I was, I think, saying was, no, if we're going to talk about public health, then we have to look at the whole picture. What is the entire impact holistically on public health of using this product, right? Meaning, does eliminating a measles from being endemic, from circulating in the population, a net health benefit or a net health detriment? And as I point out as I go through in detail in the book, and I've talked about in public before, when you actually look at the science, let's look at one side of the equation. What was the benefit of vis-a-vis introducing the vaccine from eliminating measles vis-a-vis mortality? Well, in the United States, as is true, by the way, in the UK and other developed countries, between 1900 and the introduction of the measles vaccine in 1963 in the United States, measles mortality declined by over 98%. In England, between 1900 and 1968, when it was introduced, it declined by over 99%. Okay. What caused that reduction in mortality? I could tell you what didn't. It wasn't vaccines. They didn't exist. Okay. By the time they introduced the vaccine, there were about 400 deaths a year from measles in the United States at a time when parts of America were still like a developing country, right? Where people will die of all kinds of disease of any kind because they don't have clean water, they don't have and so forth. Now, so those 400 folks who died was probably going to continue to decline even without a vaccination, as occur with many diseases where they tried to make a vaccine and did it, like scarlet fever and so forth. Okay. They become less pathogenic over time. But let's just assume the vaccine saves 400 lives a year in America, which, by the way, at that point translated to 1 in 450,000 Americans died of measles. 1 in 450,000. Far from the killer. Most Our health department promotes measles as if millions in America died before there was a vaccine. Okay. So 1 in 450,000 people a year at a time when everybody got measles. Now, what's the flip side to that? Well, let me tell you what the studies show. They show that those who don't get measles, okay, this was have a statistically significant increased rate of death from cardiovascular disease and from cancer. Statistically significant. For example, there was a 100,000 person study in Japan that tracked 100,000 people in Japan for over 20 years. Okay, government study, government funded, government involved study. What they found is that after 22 years, those that had measles and mumps had a 20% statistically significant reduction in death from cardiovascular disease. Think about that. 20%. Cardiovascular disease kills 800,000 Americans a year. 800,000. If eliminating measles and mumps, forget 20%, let's say 1% had a 1% effect, well, you're way past your 400 deaths. You're way past. You've already inverted your public health benefit. Cancers. The studies show that, for example, getting measles reduces, those who have had measles have a reduction of 66% decreased rate of Hodgkin's lymphoma and 166 reduction rate in non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Those kill 20,000, mostly kids a year. If you've had measles, you have half the rate of ovarian cancer. I didn't do these studies. These are by major institutions around the world. They're all there in PubMed. They're in my book. I cite to them. You can go see them. They're all in peer-reviewed literature. They're done by major institutions. And here's the thing about those studies. Some of them are bigger, like the Japan study. Some of them are smaller and retrospective, like some of the cancer studies, but they're pretty consistent. They all end up showing the same thing. So from a public health perspective, did we have a net benefit? Pathogens over time have come and gone and disappeared. Measles didn't. It could be because it has a survival benefit, that having this, what was considered generally innocuous, febrile childhood infection, conferred a survival advantage. So, now that what I just said might make people mad, but that's just the data. That's just the data. Don't get mad about it. Don't get angry. Don't get upset. It's just data. It's in studies. I'm just repeating what the studies show. That's all. So we can make good decisions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that data is the point, isn't it? I mean, and this is the fragility of the system that I operate in compared to the system that you operate in. In my world, the only chance I get to cross-examine, if you like, people that are involved in the regulation of this business is a 15-minute block on one issue, which really, goes very quickly. They're not on oath. Now, I'm not suggesting anyone's not telling the truth at all. I'm quite the opposite. I think, you've got to tell it like it is for various reasons in those forums. But if you're in a courtroom environment, you can bring other experts, you can bring evidence, and you can make the trial go as long as you want in most instances in order to get to the point. And that is the value of data. I feel like in absent more litigation, we're not going to get to that point. So that point about the 86 Act, if that was out, then presumably litigation would flow. But you've seen that clip from a couple of weeks ago here in our Senate, I think, where I asked about placebo-controlled testing. I think a very simple question. I want to ask some questions about the childhood immunisation schedule, if I could. And start with a broad question. How many vaccines are children scheduled to receive from birth to adolescence, and how many diseases does it cover as it currently stands?
I might just take some clarity from you, Senator. Professor Anthony Law, Deputy Secretary, Health Products Regulation. While the TGA undertakes the pre- and post-market authorisation monitoring of vaccines and other therapeutic goods, we're not in charge specifically of the immunisation schedule. So I might refer that question to Dr. Anna Peet from the National Immunisations Division.
Thank you.
Hello, Senator. My name's Dr. Anna Peet, First Assistant Secretary, National Immunisation Division. First of all vaccines that go on the National Immunisation Schedule go through Therapeutic Goods Administration assessment. They're also recommended by a TAGI and then also go through a Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee.
I will come to those questions. I just simply start with the first. Okay. How many are there? Thank you, Doc.
We've got 31 vaccines in total.
For how many diseases?
For 18 diseases, but that's for adults and children.
Right.
For children, I think it's about 16, but David Laffin will have to take your notice.
You take on notice how many?
But the vast majority are for children.
Okay. All right. Well, then, of those vaccines, how many placebo-controlled studies have been done on vaccines on the childhood schedule?
Senator, that'd be a very difficult question to answer, and the TGA might be able to add to that,
Sure.
Who do the initial assessment on the safety and efficacy of the vaccines.
Sure.
Thanks very much. I'm just going to ask Dr. Nitin Bagul, who's one of our senior medical officers, to the table to respond to that.
Thank you, Senator, for the question. Dr. Nitin Bakul, Principal Medical Advisor, Prescription Medicine Authorization Branch, Medicines Regulation Division. Can I please ask you to repeat the question?
Yeah, the question is, how many placebo-controlled studies have been done on vaccines on the childhood schedule?
I can take that question on notice. I don't have it in hand at the moment.
You need to take that on notice?
Yes.
I would just highlight, if I may, Senator, this is a question that's also been asked of other regulators. I think part of the challenge that we have is that while it is frequently held that placebo-controlled or double-blinded or randomised controlled trials are the gold standard in science, and certainly in the introduction of new medicines, particularly when there's no established standard of treatment, that is often the case. There are fairly substantial ethical questions to be answered around introducing a placebo-controlled trial when there is a demonstrated effective medication that is used to either prevent or treat treatment. So, for instance, given that we do have demonstrable efficacy of vaccines for many vaccine-preventable diseases, it would be ethically not only questionable but probably not arguable that a placebo-controlled trial would be appropriate, given that you would actually have to specifically not vaccinate children, expose them to the disease that we know has serious morbidity when we also know we have an effective.
So these are injections that we're giving to almost every child in the country at the moment, and they're not. And we can't say at this stage. You have to take on notice how many placebo-controlled studies have been done, which is the gold standard.
No,
it's not the gold standard.
I might just try and explain it in a different way, Senator. The gold standard for science is contextual, and so when there are new treatments to be determined, absolutely there is a preference for a placebo-controlled trial. So you can compare a control arm with an intervention arm, and that way you're able to remove a number of the confounding factors, but also able to demonstrate both the risk and the benefit of that treatment. When there is an established treatment for which there is not only demonstrated efficacy in terms of preventing the disease and the consequences of the disease, but also decades of real-world evidence on the safety and the positive risk-benefit analysis, the lack of an ethical basis for a placebo-controlled trial where, as I say, there is an accepted and efficacious treatment for a significant disease with significant morbidity, that cannot be described as gold standard.
How many are we talking about? Many of these cover multiple antigens, and I think in 1990, the full schedule was 21 antigens, and now it's about 60. So with that in mind, what placebo-controlled safety studies have been done examining the combination of multiple antigens in these injections?
Yes, thank you for that question as well, Senator. The growth or the evolution in the immunisation schedule, and again, it might be something that Dr. Pete might like to comment on, has been cited as a challenge, and it has been in some quarters, and I'm not suggesting you're doing this at all, Senator, but in some quarters has been spuriously associated with the rise in certain diseases or disease states. The reality is the antigenic load that is experienced by children has decreased over the years, despite the fact that the number of antigens which provide coverage.
How is that?
The volume of the antigenic load.
So, all right. So with that in mind then, back to the question, what placebo-controlled safety studies have been done examining that reduced antigen load?
Yeah, so I think it's the comment about the antigenic load is not around the impact or the immunogenic response in the patient. It's about what is presented to the children, and there is an enormous amount of work that's being undertaken by ATAGI on a regular basis in recommending the what goes into the schedule, and that's one of the considerations. I think, as Dr. Bagul has said, we will provide you with information.
Okay.
Given the number of vaccines and the number of diseases for which we vaccinate, it would be more appropriate, I think, probably to
I'm staggered that can't be provided now, given the history. But just to go back to your point, so
information on notice.
Yes.
The question there, as we saw, is really about the issue of blind placebo-controlled testing, which is probably not the exact phrase, but this is the sort of testing that is generally considered to be the gold standard for therapeutic goods and pharmaceuticals. And the question I asked was, okay, how many on the childhood schedule, immunisation schedule in Australia have had that? And of course, delved into taking it on notice, which means they'll ask it another day or they'll come back to me and all this sort of stuff. Now, if it were any other therapy, you would assume the answer would be, yes, we have, and it's okay, it's fine.
in this instance, it's not. What did you make of that clip? And is that the case everywhere across the world? I mean, obviously it must be, that there just isn't that hard and fast data on placebo trials. And if not, why not?
I could tell you that definitively. I could tell you categorically that that is true of every routine injected vaccine in the United States. Not a single one of those, and our schedule is far larger than your schedule in Australia. And they're not the same brand, but they're typically often the same company making the same product, just with different brand names in different countries. Okay. And I could tell you that categorically in the United States, every single one of the routine injected child vaccines was not licensed based on a placebo-controlled clinical trial. Not a single one of them. Chapter 10 of my book goes through every single one of those trials and all has citations to the FDA source that proves what I just said. But not only that, going to the third person who answered your question, and he said, well, it's not ethical because we have to use the standard of care. So we have to use the existing vaccine. Well, let me answer to that. In the US, at least, and I'm assuming it'll be the same in Australia, anytime another vaccine was used as the control, okay, instead of a placebo, which means something inert, that vaccine was not licensed based on a placebo-controlled trial. And if that vaccine had a trial, that vaccine was not licensed based on a placebo-controlled trial. I trace every single routine injected vaccine in that matter on the childhood schedule in the United States in my book in chapter 10. So I can say this categorically that that's true. Now, let me add this. Even if you did use a placebo-controlled group, right? Meaning you had one group that got something inert, like a saline injection, and one group that the experimental group. That's one element of a good clinical trial. If you have that, then you still need to review safety long enough. So if you inject it into a baby and you look at safety for only a few months, that's not useful. Or a few weeks or a few days, that's not useful. And then if you do look at safety long enough, right, you track them for long enough to see, did they develop developmental issues? Did they develop autoimmune issues later? Did they develop whatever? Then you still have to have enough kids in the trial to be what epidemiologists would say properly powered. You need all three of those. You need to be proper controlled. So either a placebo or another vaccine that was properly licensed based on a placebo-controlled trial that's root safety enough with enough kids. It needs to review safety long enough and needs to have enough kids. So it needs to have all of those elements. And when you look across all those clinical trials for every routine injected child vaccine in the U.S., and I would imagine it's similar in Australia, but I would have to 100% confirm that. I would be very surprised if it wasn't the same. There's not a single one. Not only because they lack placebo, they often don't review safety long enough and they're underpowered. I'll give you an example. The hepatitis B vaccine given to newborn babies in the United States, first day of life. There's only 2 of them in the U.S. It's licensed in the United States based on a clinical trial that reviewed safety for 5 days. It monitored safety for 5 days after injection. 5 days. In a trial with 147 kids and no control group. That's it. If I had to come up with the most nefarious thing that you ask, like if I had to dream up something nefarious, I wouldn't even come up with that because you'd laugh at me. You'd say that's so ridiculous. But that's directly on the FDA website. The other vaccine was licensed based on 4 days of safety monitoring after injection. That's laughable. Most drugs are licensed based on multi-year placebo-controlled trial. And the why for why that is, we discussed earlier.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that is powerful, though, I guess, is just asking the question, which you do every day of the week, but that's what that's all about. But the other thing that was called for so long was a proper study into those children that were vaccinated and compared them to those that were unvaccinated in a proper study format. It turns out we learned as a result of your testimony in the Senate back in September that study was done. It was called the Henry Ford study, and it showed that effectively there were something like 5 times the rates of chronic health diseases with the vaccinated group, which is paraphrasing. Obviously it delves into a lot more detail than that about the specific problems. That is a very worrying study. I asked them about that study as well, and the TGA, our FDA, told me yes, they were aware of it and they were reviewing it. Of course, they always come back to the issue, it's unpublished. Well, of course it's unpublished. I mean, the reality seems to be that getting these things published is almost impossible or career-ending. That seems to be what we learned from that. But Can you take me back about a little bit about the study, the Henry Ford study, and how it is it came that you ended up delivering that? Because I think in terms of the alarm bells, I think that was one of the biggest blows biggest alarm bells that's been rung for a long period of time. A very, very important study in my book.
Well, as for the study itself, anybody can read the unpublished study. There's a link to it on an inconvenientstudy.com. The nonprofit ICANN, the Informed Consent Action Network, which actually funds a lot of the vaccine policy work my firm does, created a whole documentary about it, actually, that includes footage of Del Bigtree, the CEO of that nonprofit, meeting with the lead listed author on the unpublished study and asking him, "Is it a good study? Why didn't you publish it?" Stuff like that, and you could see the answer for yourself. I don't want to ruin the film that they put out. With that said, if going back to the clinical trials did not validate that these vaccines are safe. So what are you left with then? Once it's licensed, they will say, "Oh, it's unethical to now do a placebo-controlled trial because the product's licensed." Obviously, if you actually look at the medical ethics literature, I think there's a very good argument that it's unethical not to do it because you never did it. But let's just put that aside, okay? But they'll say it's unethical to do it. So then what are you left with? How are you going to assess the safety of the vaccine schedule? Well, then you have to engage in what's known as a retrospective epidemiological study, population studies looking at existing data sets and seeing what is the safety profile of those who got the vaccines and don't get it. The best place to start is to look at kids with no vaccines to kids who get one or more vaccines, and you want to compare those two groups. And if you see the unvaccinated are healthier, well, then you drill down. Then you can maybe do more detailed studies, which vaccine, what timing, and so forth. But that would be the place to start. It's the logical place to start. It's where I would start if I was studying asbestos. Those who were exposed to asbestos, those not exposed to asbestos. It's where you would start for any type of study that looked at the safety of a product, exposed to unexposed.
It's interesting with that study that the results were so statistically significant, even for someone that can barely count like me. It's so obviously a story, and yet really outside, Twitter and some of the alternative media, it doesn't raise any alarm bells. Quite interesting, isn't it, when you look at the role of the media in all of this as well? I mean, the United States pharmaceutical products can be advertised. Australians always find that incredible when, I remember it from the airport, seeing ads for childhood vaccinations as you're waiting to line up and, going through airports. In Australia, that's not the case. In Australia, pharmaceutical products can't be advertised, but complementary medicines can be. There is this uneasy problem with the media whereby if you're getting billions of dollars in revenue from pharmaceutical companies, you're unlikely to report the story, aren't you? That should have been front page news as far as I'm concerned, but it wasn't. Should I be as cynical about it as that, or is that too cynical?
I think that cynicism is well founded when you look across the board and you look at what those who were the editors-in-chief and editors of the major journals will tell you about pharma's influence. And we see very clearly what happens to scientists who dare publish studies that go against the dogma, that go against the beliefs with regards to these products. There's example after example during COVID of the doctors that stood up to just say, hey, look, this therapeutic is working, or this vaccine, I'm seeing injuries in my clinic, doing exactly what medical professionals should do. So I don't think it's cynical. I think that you're very based in saying that.
So I know because it's above me in the sign. I'm conscious of your time. Obviously, things are getting late, and thanks for doing this. But I'm just interested in the future because, I think we're seeing the questions being asked now, finally. I think it's incumbent on people like me and people like you to do that because the doctors are perhaps more scrutinised, although it's danger ground for everyone, obviously. But we have to ask the questions, we have to rely on data, and we have to be brave about it. The injection of Secretary Kennedy into the US has been, I think, a very important feature of this as well. Of course, there are people throw names at him and whatever else. I've never heard him say anything personally that I think I've never heard it. Maybe he has, but I've never heard him say anything that's particularly outrageous. He seems to be following a similar line. Let's make sure everything's safe. Let's look at the data. What can we expect, do you think, out of the future of Maha, Make America Healthy Again, and from the work that's being done with him? Hopefully that work continues. Is there, do you think we're on the cusp of getting to some answers here, and is there more on the horizon? And hopefully that'll trickle through to Australia.
I know that Secretary Kennedy is, I believe, doing, he's got his heart solely focused and his mind focused on trying to save as many kids as possible. I believe that. And I think that he is trying to, I'm going to assume he's deploying as much resources and funding. And you've heard some of those announcements of lots of money flowing to conducting studies that look at environmental insults that could result in some form of disease or some kind of injury. And so those studies will take time. But, there are other things that I believe the secretary is trying to do along the way. A lot of that's been reported upon. So I'm very hopeful. But, the machine of government turns slow.
Yeah.
The machine of science turns slow. And he faces a lot of headwinds. I mean, $1 trillion plus of entrenched financial interests, kind of headwinds, because not just vaccines, but he's going to looking at all potential exposures that could harm children. Exactly what our government should be doing, or else stop taking our money and just get out of the business of regulating, right? Because all you're doing is then giving the imprimatur as if these products are safe when you really haven't studied them. And that's true of other products too, beyond vaccines. Beyond that headwind of fighting against massive corporate entrenched interests with their lobbyists and their influence and so forth, he runs the Department of Health and Human Services, which is the CDC, the FDA, and NIH, all the health agencies. They have about 65,000 employees. And I can tell you, after spending a decade of FOIAing and litigating with those in those agencies, especially those regarding vaccines, the closer they are, for example, to working on vaccines, the more of zealots they are. I know this from their internal emails. So he's facing a massive 65,000 person bureaucracy below him that in large respects are going to fight against him. At the top of it is about 200 political appointees. So you could see what he's facing there. And of course, he also, above him, has the White House, which I think, is showing pretty good signs a little more recently of maybe working with him more and so forth. There's politics are complicated. I don't envy what you do.
Yeah, thanks for that. No, thank you for what you've been doing, and all the work that's going on over there. I think it's making really important tremors all around the world, and it's all about the data. It's all about the truth, and it's all about the health of kids. So it's really important stuff. Thanks for coming on Base. Great to talk to you, and hope we'll talk again soon.
Thank you. Thank you for everything you're doing.